I'm Lin-Manuel Miranda, and you're listening to Hard NOC Life.
Well, it's the NOC in full color, you see me? The Hard NOC Life, comics, movies, and TV, yeah. Pop culture with a
Welcome to Hard NOC Life. I'm Keith Chow. Today I'm joined by a very, very special guest. He is an award-winning filmmaker, writer, co-founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop. This fall, his memoir called Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant will publish in October. And if anyone's ever listened to me on this podcast or my other one, Southern Fried Asian, you know how I love talking about growing up in Chinese restaurants. So I'm very excited to have Curtis Chin.
Thank you, Keith. Fellow Chinese restaurant kid. I feel like club.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, when you told me about this book, I was so excited about it because I just have an affinity for people. I think it's not a small club because Chinese restaurants are the most prevalent cuisine in America. But I do feel like it's a club, and particularly like Cantonese Chinese food. So yeah. I wanted to just start off. What prompted you to want to tell your memoir now?
Well, I've been wanting to tell it for a while. It takes a while to write a book. It's just, why did it get published now is a different question.
True.
Later on. But, so I make documentaries. That's been my day job for the last decade or so. And, I'd go around. I've been to like over 500-600 places around the world giving talks after my films. And oftentimes the audience would ask the same questions about like, well, what was it like growing up in your family's business? What was it like growing up in Detroit? And so I eventually just started jotting down some of these answers I would have, while waiting in the hotel room. And I thought like, oh, well, this could make an interesting book. And I just started writing it. Unfortunately, that book did not sell when it was just about the family, the craziness of the family, my mean grandma, Chinese food, all those good stuff. It didn't get much traction. But frankly, I'll be honest with you, it was after the murder of George Floyd when I reconceived the book a little bit to talk more about racial identity, that formation of being Asian in a black and white city like Detroit, but also coming out. Because that wasn't in my first, in all the when I was writing it for those first few years, it really was about my younger childhood, being a middle child. But as soon as I shifted it to a slightly older age, looking about, grappling with the issues of race and gender and religion and things like that, the book really took off. And, I had multiple agents pursuing me. It went through a bidding war. The book sold in 3 weeks. So a lot of that's about timing, right?
Well, and I think, and this as one of the founders of the AAWW, like it is also a different world for Asian American writers and storytellers. Like our stories are finally being valued by publishing companies and movie studios and all these other places that typically used to gatekeep Asian American stories. So I think that's another probably example of the strike while the iron is hot.
Oh yeah, totally. So after founding the Writers Workshop, I moved out to Hollywood. And I was working as a TV writer for a short period of time. And definitely when I was pursuing that, there were no other Asian American writers, and well, there were few. Yes, there were some. I shouldn't say that. There were some,
right.
But there were few and far in between. And diversity just was not an issue. And even if there were other writers of color, you weren't hearing that they were pitching specifically Asian American projects, right? And so that has definitely changed, where even now, companies are pursuing me and asking me, because I'm working with a couple of large entities now on a couple of projects that are with queer Asian protagonists, which is kind of exciting, and that never would have happened.
Unheard of like 5-10 years ago, 20 years ago, especially unheard of that. We're recording this just a couple weeks after the Oscars, right? Michelle Yeoh, Ke Huy Quan, Everything Everywhere All at Once. Dominating the Oscars, like in a very Asian American film with Asian American actors, with Asian American filmmakers winning like multiple Oscars. It's just unheard of for especially you and I have toiled in this world for years to see kind of like the environment now. I only wonder what it would be like to think that this is what the future looks like.
Now, I remember hanging out in New York City with people like Jeff Yang the week before All American Girl was about to come out, and hanging out with Margaret Cho, and the excitement of that moment. And then that what should you call it? A desert for the next 15 years. After
Right.
that, there's nothing. And then obviously, a small trickle of things where something would pop up every now and then. And just this explosion really post, I think, fresh off the boat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then not just what happened a couple of weeks ago, but everything that's in the pipeline
Right.
coming up. It's just incredible. American-born Chinese, beef,
The
just
joyride. Right. I mean, and what I love about, and I said this on a podcast a couple episodes ago, but what I love about the stories of Asian Americans coming out in the post Everything Everywhere world, movies like Beef, movies like Joyride, they're not stereotypical intergenerational trauma immigrant stories. It's like raunchy comedy and revenge comedy and like fantasy coming of age story. There's the Disney movie recently, Chan Can Dunk, about a Asian American kid who wants to dunk a basketball to impress a girl, right? Like it's not the stereotypical Asian American stories that we kind of expect would get the green light.
Yeah. And particularly if you pay attention to books, if you look at the young adult space, there's so many Asian American young adult books coming out. And I'm sure that a lot of those will also maybe see the light of day as a film or TV thing. So yeah.
I mean, Jenny Han is a cottage industry of just her books being turned into Netflix shows. So
yeah.
But I want to talk about your story in particular, because as a documentarian, where you're the subjects of your movies have been pretty iconic things, like the murder of Vincent Chin, like the late great photographer Corky Lee, like standardized testing, like these are things that are so indelible to being Asian American. What is it like to turn that lens onto yourself as a documentarian? Is it weird to because normally you're the observer of these things, and now you're turning that, in a sense, documentarian lens on your own past. Walk me through that mindset.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I've never been asked that before. It's interesting though, because even as I was making those other films, people would always ask me my perspective on it, or
Sure.
say, well, you should appear in the film. But I always wanted to keep this distance. I think that when it came to writing the book, though, I didn't really have a filter. I just tried to be as honest as possible, trying to bring myself back into that moment. Because really, for me, I was writing this book not just for myself, but also for my family and also for my nieces and nephews. Because my family's had a long history in Michigan, right? They arrived like in the late 1800s. I jokingly say in the book that my great-great-grandfather moved from Canton, China to Canton, Ohio, before realizing that there were no Chinese people there. So we've had this long history in the Midwest, and we don't live there anymore, right? We've all moved out to California. And part of it was writing this book that would share this history with the next generation in my family, my nieces and nephews, who have no connection to that Michigan Asian American experience. So I just tried to be as truthful and honest about that as possible. And so one of the good things about me is that I don't really have a filter. So, I just sort of like say and do and follow whatever is on my mind or heart. So that's the same way I sort of approach the book, for better or worse.
Yeah. Well, and I normally have these kinds of conversations, I feel like, on my other podcast, Southern Fried Asian, in which I talk to Asian Americans who had an upbringing or a connection to the American South, in particular, because I'm from Virginia, rural Virginia. And because oftentimes I say I'm from Virginia and people are like, what, Annandale? That's not really Southern. I'm like, no, I'm from like rural Virginia. So anyway, having grown up in the Midwest, I feel like there is similarities in the kind of upbringing that you have as an Asian American, as a Chinese American in the Midwest. That's similar, if not exactly the same, as someone growing up in the South, because in both cases, it's different than growing up Asian American in like California or New York, right? You're not necessarily surrounded by an Asian community and having a lot of Asian, like, as you said, growing up in Detroit, it's very black and white, literally and figuratively. So what kinds of experiences do you feel like would be similar between like my experience growing up in the South and your experience growing up in the Midwest?
Lack of access to a lot of cultural things, I would guess.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm trying to think of a joke for this, because it's even...
Well, I think the other difference too, because I think nowadays in particular, growing up Asian in the South or the Midwest is less isolating because of the internet. You and I remember a world before instant communication existed, right? And I think that's the other kind of like isolating factor, being Asian in a non-Asian part of the country.
Yeah, well, I can't really say for South West Virginia or whatever part of Virginia you're from, but I know that for me, growing up in Detroit, it was a very tight-knit community because there were so few of us, right?
Right.
Like I say in the book, one of the most popular phrases growing up was fight between a black and a white. And as an Asian, I really didn't know where to turn to, right? And so I would look for any other non-white or non-black person. And oftentimes those were the other Asians. Growing up in that Chinatown in Detroit, which was a good mix of Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Afghani, I'd always grown up very comfortably identifying as Asian American. It didn't seem artificial to me.
Mhm.
And even when we went off to high school, when my family moved to a predominantly white neighborhood, which was like a graduating class of 400 people. There were about maybe a dozen Asians in my school, in my grade. But amongst that group, the Asians all hung out together. And I jokingly say, maybe it's because we all took the same advanced math and science classes. There seemed to be a connection in that experience. And so I've always thought of myself more as Asian American in some ways than even Chinese American.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something where there is maybe a disconnect, because I always say on my other podcast that like the only other Asians where I grew up in Luray, Virginia, which is like northwestern part of the state, was my family. Like if you like there were no other Asians we weren't related to. And they were all mixed, and all my cousins are mixed anyway. So like I joke, if you look up like the Wikipedia stats of Luray, Virginia in the 80s, and it says like 0.01% Asian.
Yeah,
that's just my family. It's like nobody else.
So did your family inherit that business, or how did
my family immigrated to Washington. I mean, similar. I have a somewhat similar, like in the sense that my family, at least my mother's side of the family, has been in this country since the 19th century. Mm-hmm. But I'm also the son of immigrants. Like my parents directly immigrated from Hong Kong, but they immigrated to first Washington, D.C., and then West Virginia. They spent some time. And then my grandfather found an ad for a restaurant in this small town, which is about 2 hours from D.C. Yeah. And it was an American restaurant. In fact, the name of the restaurant until they sold it about 10 years ago was Brown's. And then when my family took it over, they just called it Brown's Chinese and American Restaurant. So like our menu was half Chinese food and half, they kept like the hamburgers and the spaghetti from like the previous menu. And it was
it wasn't even a Chinese restaurant you took over.
It was. I mean, we essentially added like, sweet and sour chicken. And
you converted it to Chinese.
We converted it to a Chinese American restaurant. Right. So, and we sold all of the standard Chinese American fare. And then eventually my parents moved to another part of Virginia, closer to Virginia Beach, which is in the southeastern part of the state. And we opened our own Chinese restaurant, which was full Chinese American restaurant, takeout and dine in. Yeah. And so like, I mean, one of the things, and I've said this many times, and I was saying this to you earlier, that growing up amongst Chinese American food, like the General Tso's chicken and the egg rolls and the egg foo young and stuff, like I have an affinity for it in the sense that I feel like when I hear people complain about quote unquote horseshit Chinese food, that was I think Andrew Zimmern called it that, the mall Chinese food, like, Panda Express or whatever. But even like, prominent Asian Americans, talk about how inauthentic going to a Chinese restaurant is.
Or real Chinese food.
Right. I get it's not real. I get a little offended by it because I feel like Chinese American food in particular is the most authentic Asian American food because it's an adaptation of what came before, but using the ingredients of what's here to create something new. What do you think?
I mean, well, obviously I love Chinese American food. I mean, so I guess I should make that distinction, Chinese American versus Chinese food. Mm-hmm. It is as American as apple pie. I mean, it's everywhere. And, you say General Tso's chicken, or in Detroit, we had something called almond boneless chicken, mm-hmm. but, chop suey, all of these things. I mean, that is America, right? And so, I love it. I think it's great, But you know what I mean? Like
I'm sure you've seen the YouTube videos where like the Fung brothers bring Jeremy Lin into like a Chinese American restaurant and they're all just making fun of the food, or like there was this BuzzFeed video a couple years ago where like these millennial Chinese kids would like serve Panda Express to their parents and grandparents, and like they're all kind of like mocking it. But then the funny thing is the parents are like, That's pretty good. It's fine. I don't know why you're like making a big deal out of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you had to ask me what is my preference, obviously my preference is Chinese American food because that's what I grew up with. I mean, we all have this connection between the food that we ate as a kid. And so for me, that was eating these Americanized versions or these Cantonese versions of like basic things like beef and mushroom or like, almond boneless chicken, which is just basically like a fried fillet of chicken with brown gravy on it. But the stat that I always love to throw out is that my family's restaurant was opened in 1940 by my great grandfather, and we had it open for about 60 years, and in that time period, guess the number of egg rolls they sold in 60 years.
Oh, I would say it rivals the number of McDonald's hamburgers that are sold.
Exactly. And these were all handmade by my grandmother, even the skin and the sauce. In the course of 60 years, they sold over 10 million egg rolls.
Right.
I mean, they were selling like over 4,000 every week. It was crazy how popular these egg rolls were. So for me, that's, whether it's the type of egg roll you might find in China or not, I don't really know. But for me, that was my family. That's represented, my city. It's just so much affection towards that type of cuisine. So yeah, no.
100. I mean, that's the power of food too. Like why food and culture are so intertwined, right? Because to your point, like your grandparents' literal, I won't say literal blood, sweat, and tears because then it's a little like, oh no, what am I eating? But you know what I mean? Like the effort that they're putting into hand rolling each individual egg roll and making the sauce. Like it's to say that's inauthentic, I think is just dismissive of what it means to be a Chinese American immigrant, a Chinese American person in the 60 years that your restaurant was around, like putting that work in. There's nothing inauthentic about that.
Yeah. And I think that also misses the point about food and culture is that it's an ever evolving thing, right? Yeah, there's traditional foods and it's always great to honor that. But also the wonderful thing about cuisine is that it adapts to situations and ingredients and time periods and flavors. And it's an evolving record of people and culture, right? And so to not acknowledge that and not to respect it, I think is really kind of missing the point.
And that's why I think of Chinese American food in particular as such an analogy to the Chinese American experience, right? We mentioned the show coming out, American Born Chinese, based on Gene Yang's book. But like the Chinese American experience is also kind of about taking, at least for me, and I don't want to speak for you or for others, but like, and I think it's prevalent in your book though, but like taking those aspects of being Chinese, but also being American, right? Like having those conversations where your grandma, your mom is speaking to you in Cantonese and you're responding in English or like a mix of both. And you know what I mean? Like there are aspects of both that make you who you are, but you are fully, in my opinion, you're fully both.
I think that you can actually, if you just did an historical analysis of Chinese food in America, you can learn so much about Chinese American history, period.
Yeah.
Whether you're talking about immigration, whether you're talking about racism, whether you're talking about any of these things. So for instance, just even the introduction of Chinese food, and I mentioned this in my book, where it's like prior to that, Chinese food wasn't accepted. It was really something that was just in the community. But it was after, World War II where it really kind of exploded, right? Because, you had this whole middle class in America and they needed cheaper foods to eat, and Chinese food to sort of fit into that. And then obviously with the immigration patterns that changed and different types of non-Cantonese Chinese moved into the country, you can see that in the cuisine and how that's changed too. Right. And even now, when you talk about fusion food, maybe some ways that is a conscious acknowledgement of the blending or the fusion that a lot of Chinese Americans are trying to engage in. So, yeah, you can do a lot of sociological studies just by examining the food, and the changes within the Chinese American menu, I guess.
100%. Well, so you are at heart a Michigander, right? Is that the proper term for someone from Michigan?
Yeah, Detroit.
Which kind of also, I think, explains why your first movie was Vincent Hu. Like, you're intrinsically tied to that story. What led you to create that documentary? What was it at this point? Was it been 15 years?
Yeah, it's been a while. I mean, specifically what happened with that was that, I was working as a TV writer at that time, working on a Disney Channel show, and I get this terrible phone call that my parents were in a car accident back home. And I had to rush back home. And sadly, my dad had passed away, from the accident. and I didn't know what we were going to do. I mean, my mom was physically injured, and I was the one drafted in our family to sell the family business and sell the family home. I was the one that had to stick by. And even though the Disney Channel had called and wanted me to put me on another show, I just wasn't in the mood to pitch jokes or to pitch funny stories. And so I thought back to this case of Vincent Chin, who, was a case that always impacted my life. It happened when I was a freshman in high school, and he was a close family friend. My uncle was his best man, so it was very impactful in terms of me, because at that age you're really trying to figure out your identity, right? And so my response to that, actually, and I say this in the book, is that I became a Republican, but that's a whole nother story. But because I had to, in some ways, I had to overcompensate and prove that I was really patriotic and very pro-American, particularly in a place like Detroit. And so that seemed to fit the narrative. But yeah, that's why I wanted to do it. I wanted to do something a project that I thought my dad would care about, because, he was my dad's friend, and it just seemed like the right project to do. And it sort of set me on a different journey in life. Right?
I was going to say that led you down this path of being a documentarian, like, because as you said before that, prior to that, you were working in kind of like the studio space, where you're working on sitcoms or whatever, and you kind of shifted from television writing to doing documentaries, because you followed it up with several others, tackling, as I said, things that are important to the Asian American community too, like the idea of standardized testing, and like I said, your most recent short film documenting Corky Lee's life. And for those who may not be familiar, Corky Lee was a native New Yorker whose photography documenting the Asian American experience in New York is again an indelible document on our history and our experience. So what made you, like, after Vincent Hu, and it was rather successful, like, what made you decide, like, this is the path I want to tell these kinds of stories going forward?
I mean, frankly, that decision was made for me, in the sense that even before I finished the film, I was getting invitations from colleges to come screen the film. And in the end, I screened it at over 500 places, and I was never in town in Los Angeles to go out for jobs. I figured, if you're going to make a film and people are inviting you, you should go. And so that's how it sort of happened. And after a few years, I'd been out of the Hollywood circuit for a while, and I was looking for another project to do. And that's when I read about what was happening in New York City, and I knew education and education policy was something that was really dividing our community. So I wanted to make this film called Tested, and that's how that sort of came about. And that one also similarly had a lot of success. I went to a few hundred schools with that one, including about 20 in the UK alone, just screening that film. And so, I've been happy in that space. It's allowed me to continue working with the community. It allowed me to be a little bit more political. I will have to say, in the last few years, I've gone back to TV again, partly because, like you said, new opportunities have come up, and I've been approached by, a couple of the networks and a studio to develop projects. So I'm doing that now. So I have 2 active projects, which is kind of exciting, in addition to the book. And now I'm starting to get some inquiries about the book too, and possibly turning that into maybe a film. I jokingly say, like, I don't know if I want this book to be into film, because I really don't like myself as a teenager. Because I was this really awful Asian. I was like the Asian Alex P. Keaton. I was campaigning to shut down the student smoking lounge. I was like really, really not a pleasant person at that time.
You say, though, it's like it's overcompensation, right? You have to almost prove you're in America, which I think, another part of your story, as you said, that wasn't necessarily in the initial pitch of the book, was it's also a coming out story now. And how did you reconcile that with being an Alex P. Keaton?
Well, it actually, my political journey starts with, our family ran a Chinese restaurant in the inner city. And during lunchtime, it always seemed like the welfare center, which is only 3 doors down, was busier than us. And it used to infuriate me. I was like, why are these people expecting a free lunch when my family's working, our butts off here? On top of that, Detroit was going through a lot of problems, and, a lot of people blamed it on the city, which was democratically run. And then Reagan was coming out, and Reagan had this nice positive image about make America great again, which is literally his phrase. I bought into that. But it was several things. It's actually in the book what I call the 3 A's. The first was apartheid. I did not understand how Reagan could support that clearly racist policy. The second was AIDS. As a gay person, or a closeted gay person at that time, I really bought into the whole idea of compassionate conservatism, which is what the Republicans were talking about at that time. But as the disease continued to ravage, it was clear that they had no compassion for these people. In fact, they were quite asshole-ish to the gay community. And so that really opened up my eyes too. And the third was actually abortion, apartheid, AIDS, and abortion. Abortion, because at that time I was actually anti-choice. I was pro-life because as a closeted gay man, I thought, well, I'm never going to get a girl pregnant. Why should I care? And it was only after I got to college at the University of Michigan and I had these conversations with these women who said, no, it's just about controlling your own body, that it clicked to me that, oh, it's the same thing I want to do. I just want to control my own body. I want to be able to decide things for myself. So after that, I shifted away from being, a card-carrying member of the GOP.
Well, and thank God for it. But it's also a cautionary tale in a sense too, because we're living through a political moment in which, in some polls and some studies have shown Asian Americans are definitely moving right in some cases, and there are definitely inroads being made in the Asian American community, and a lot of like communities of color, in higher levels than people anticipated voted for Trump. And I say this as someone who comes from a very conservative family as well, where I have uncles and aunts who not only vote Republican, they like hosted fundraisers for Republicans at the restaurant, So like, if there's one thing the right has on the left, is the right knows how to drive wedge issues.
Well, first I should clarify that my family was not conservative.
No, you were right. No, you were conservative. I was from a conservative Chinese American family.
I was the pink sheep in the family, as I've seen in the book, so I was the anomaly. But yeah, no, even as I was making that film Tested, which I looked at it, because I knew that there were certain elements of our community that did not have the more progressive, quote unquote, approach to education. So I went into making the film with a very open mind. And in the end, I think that I have discovered as I've gotten older is that I am probably more of a center left than I am far left, progressive. And I'm good with that because I feel like I'm probably more in alignment with the larger Asian American community. And I do say this to my progressive friends, many of them who were not happy with my film Tested because they felt like I was too sympathetic to the other side, right? The people that are for testing and things like that. And maybe I am. I mean, it's something that I grew up with culturally, and we can get a whole debate about this on a different podcast if you want. And so I feel like my positioning as an Asian American, I'm very comfortable with, and I'm also trying to push where our community needs to be because I feel like the experience of growing up in Detroit in this really black and white world has forced me to always understand that we occupy a third part of that, right? And whether or not that's a strong, viable option politically or not, maybe it wasn't so growing up. And for expediency's sake, we had to choose sides. But I think as witnessed with the growth of Asian American in the media, politically, we are also reaching that point too. And what that means is that we should start to demand our own space and our own agenda. And it is going to be a little bit different from the traditional paradigm. Okay. And so that can mean something that's going to incorporate some of these policy positions, because I don't want these Asian Americans to start voting for the Republicans. I do think that the Democrats can still hold on to them. But what it does mean is that the Democratic Party is going to have to moderate some of their positioning and their framing of some of these things to be appealing to these immigrant Asian Americans and these more conservative, moderate types of it. I'm not saying we have to give up our principles, but we do have to take into account where our community really is.
It's also interesting that I feel like the conversation about being Asian American has changed as well. Like there's a lot of thinkers and writers in Asian American spaces who are kind of questioning the whole notion of being Asian American, right? Like there is an argument that says the whole idea of Asian American is non-practical. It's a combination of a bunch of cultures and languages and histories that otherwise would not be lumped together. Again, as someone who was a foundational member of the Asian American movement in terms of like creating the Writers Workshop, and you've done a lot of activism and work in the community. Where do you stand on that?
Are you saying the basic notion of whether or not an Asian American community
is real?
Well, as I said before, it's always been real to me, not because it was a cultural thing, right? One of the things that I often talk about is, with the Vincent Chin case, people say like, well, how did you get this political movement happening there overnight? And I tell people it didn't happen overnight. The Asian American community was already in contact with each other. In order to get all those people to that first rally, what they did was they went down the list of all the restaurant owners who were already in communication with each other, because we always did our annual food festivals together. So because we already had developed these relationships, and oftentimes it was culture, it's friends. I mean, to me, it's always been very natural. And the other thing that I would say about this is that you can question whether or not there's this concept of an Asian American or not, but it's the same thing that all communities in this country go through, whether you're Black or whether you're Latino or whether even you're white. I mean, if you go back 100, 150 years, there were no white people in this country. They were Italian or they're English or Scottish, but it became a politically convenient, term, white. Just like the term Christian. There were no Christians before, but it became a politically expedient, class now. And I think that Asian Americans are just similarly following that, right? In a multicultural society, you sort of look around and you find the people that you have the most similarities with. It doesn't mean that you're 100% the same. Like even within my own family, I'm not 100% the same. You know what I mean? But there are enough similarities in the experience. And beyond that, there's a value and an excitement, and energy to working together and building across different ethnic groups, whether you're Chinese, whether you're Indian, whether you're Vietnamese. We're not all from the same background, but it's kind of exciting when we get to work together and we all bring our own different experiences and where we can sort of see where they're in alignment and when they're not, right?
And also, isn't that indicative of, or it's like a microcosm for being American writ large, right? Like the whole idea of a multicultural, multiracial community is that, yes, you don't come from the same places, you don't speak the same language, but somehow you work together because the idea of the community is more important. And so that's what drives me crazy about like people who say, yeah, Asian American isn't real because blah, 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 blah. It's like, then America's not real, right? Like, then we shouldn't strive to be an American because like, white people don't own the term American, even though a lot of our people like will just, when they say American, it's equivalent to white. And I used to always, push back against that and say that, like what you said earlier, chop suey is as American as apple pie.
People in the United States don't own the term American. I mean, people in South America are American too.
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, it is strange, but like you said, it's a great opportunity for us as Asian Americans, because if we can get this right within our own community, then maybe America on a larger scale can also get this right of how do you live in a multicultural society? How do you appreciate your differences, but you stress your commonalities that brings you together,
right?
And not the things that divide you. And so this is what I say to other people who question this idea of being Asian American, because the term in some ways is still kind of nebulous and people don't have a full, clear understanding of what it means. It's actually a very exciting time to be an Asian American because you can help infuse meaning to this word, right? You can help define whether or not Asian American is a more progressive term or a more conservative term. What are the values? What are the priorities of it? And so, instead of complaining and scratching your head and saying, well, what does this mean? Maybe you can just jump in and sort of, throw in your opinion and help define this experiment or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing I know this is not Southern Fried Asian, although this conversation here tends to be reminiscent of the conversations I have on that other podcast. We'll make an exception, Midwestern Fried American. But one of the questions I always ask my guests on Southern Fried is, being Asian American, being Asian, food is such an important part of culture. As someone who grew up in a restaurant, I'm assuming food is very important to you. And one thing I do love about the book, I for what it's worth, I have an advanced reader copy. The book comes out in October. I'm special, so I have one now. But you've kind of like formatted it in a way like to a Chinese menu, right? The chapters are divided by different entrees. What specific dish from your family's restaurant brings you the most joy when you think of it, brings you the most nostalgia when you think about it?
Well, first I should say that the book is labeled as different menu items, but it's actually 8 stories in middle school, 8 in high school, and 8 in college. So I do the 8-8-8 thing. There's so
very
many
Chinese
eggs of Chinese America in writing the book. God, it's if you're talking about appetizers, it has to be the egg rolls, just because we spend so much time making them. But if you're talking about dishes, I guess there's a couple. One would be the almond boneless chicken, which is a very Detroit thing. There's a debate as to whether it's originated in Detroit or Ohio. right? But my grandma seems to think that we created it. So I'm going
Like your family alone created it?
Yeah, I don't know if that's true or not, but she seems to think so, or she thought so when she was alive. But one of the running jokes in the book is that everybody in my family had a knack for cooking, right? My grandmother had her treats. My grandfather made his barbecue. My dad made the best Chinese food. My mom made the best Western food. Everybody cooked except for me. I was like the worst cook in the family. And so that was the running joke. And eventually at some point, and I get it together and I'm somehow able to create a dish that finally makes it onto the menu. So I won't tell you what that dish is, but that's a little...
You have to get the book.
You have to get the book. You have to read the book to find out, how did I finally get my act together to finally, cook something that was edible? I didn't get my family to run away. And it is...
Well, there's a reason why you didn't inherit the restaurant, though, I guess, right?
Yeah. But it's an epiphany where, like I have in the book, where, for me, growing up, eating Chinese food was always a communal thing. It was always about big family get-togethers, multiple dishes on the Lazy Susan and stuff like that. And at some point, I realized that that pressure of having a group family meal was too much, and that there's a journey I go through in the book about understanding food and eating and my relationship to cooking too. And I don't want to say it's a metaphor for myself too, but yeah.
Well, there's a little bit of a metaphor there. Well, Curtis, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very excited for everyone else to get the book. It's available for pre-order now. Can you let folks know where they can find it? What's the best way to pre-order it, and also follow you on the internet?
Yeah, well, so the book is called Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. It's coming out October 17th, and I'm just trying to get the word out now, because pre-orders are so important, because the more pre-orders you get, the more likely, your publisher will put money into publicizing the book. But so far, there's been a lot of good buzz on it, so I'm pretty excited about that. You can order it through Barnes & Noble, Amazon, bookshop.org, any of the major places. You can follow me on my website, Curtis from Detroit, where I actually I put Vincent Hu online for free there. And Dear Corky will also go online for free there in May. The only one that I do charge for is Tested, but who knows, maybe I'll eventually put that online for free too. And so, yeah, that's probably the best way to follow me. Info@Curtis from Detroit. And I am touring around. I'm traveling all over in promotion of this book, but also for the Dear Corky film. So you can check out my schedule on the internet. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Curtis. This has been wonderful. We'd love to have you back. Maybe we can dive into more nerdy shit when you come back.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. There's so many, fun stuff. And as we get closer, maybe we can talk more specific Chinese foods or something like that.
Absolutely. I'd love to do that. Love talking Chinese food.
Great.
Thanks, Curtis.